Just to, you got it. So welcome to everybody for the second session of Broken Systems. And this is both something that continues the first session and is also designed as a standalone session. And so Megan and I and all of you are going to talk together about an insight approach to systems and how systems work and the ways in when systems are not achieving their intended outcomes, kind of how to understand that and where might be some options to move towards more alignment. And is there anything more that you'd like to say, Megan, before we kind of get started in the conversation between the two of us, which we then open up to inviting other people to contribute along your experiences as well as your thoughts about the content that we have and about insight more generally?
Yeah, thank you. No, I think that's a really great introduction. I would love to just be reminded who did join last month. And if you did, just kind of raise your hand. All right, great. So we've got about half who did. And I'd love to start. Was there anything, that stuck with you or that you are still kind of wondering about and hoping to tackle today? That's kind of a big question, but would love to hear from you at the beginning.
And along those lines too, even if there's nothing that stood out about even in questions, but even what you remember of it, because as Megan and I were talking yesterday in planning the session, what I thought of was significant and what she thought of as significant were quite different. And if you don't remember anything about it, that's fine too. But we thought we'd just take sort of, just like the first couple of minutes to reconnect to that conversation before we really begin another one. Leela, Kanata, Paige, Shauna, anything that comes to mind for you?
Well, what struck me from the last conversation was that I wanted to participate in the next because it felt to me that it was an evolving conversation and very theoretical, which I appreciated. And I was hoping that this session we would move to more practical. So it was it left me with this interest to moving forward and participating and listening again. I felt like it was the momentum was building, and I'm really interested in hearing people's practical applications of insight approach with organizations and difficulties in operations in organizations. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Shauna. And because I remember us talking quite, where Shauna is sort of connected with Inuit communities and that kind of on that sort of broad scale system changing, all those practical strategies are super important. And Cynthia, you were there as well. So again, to sort of invite you into the conversation, if there's anything that was sort of connected for you. Kanata, Paige, or Leela, or Cynthia, nothing? Not to put you on the spot.
For me, it was like a really big learning day. I took some notes that day because a lot of it's pretty new to me. But just some of the notes that I found really that I needed to understand, like you were talking about the gap between the intended outcome and your aspiration for the actual outcome. I thought that was a pretty important point for me to learn. And just talking, I made a note, I think, when you were talking about the vaccine issue and you're not coming from a place of certainty, but instead talk about it in a way of curiosity. So those were some of the things that I wrote down, and just talking also about the intended outcome and how that's different from the actual outcome. Maybe I just said that, but those were some of the notes I took. So it was good just for me to learn about these new concepts, because it's not something I had learned in my post-secondary studies before. So I was happy to think about that. And I think it's something you can use to think about when stuff isn't working and it's broken and how to fix things. So I'm back again to learn some more.
I'll jump in and sorry, my dog has some opinions.
Haircut, Paige with the awesome haircut. It's so cool.
Well, thank you. Thanks. Yeah. I think what's still kind of striking out to me and kind of to what Kanata had said is I'm still really grappling with the idea of a broken system and what that means. And then in terms of intended outcomes, who defines those outcomes? And then if we're looking to adapt systems, how those intentions adapt and who gets to kind of decide that. So I still am really grappling with even, I guess, like the fundamentals of what is a broken system? How do we know it's broken? Who defines it as being broken? And if a broken system can exist, if systems are kind of perfectly functional by definition. So I think, yeah, even the basics, but the practical piece will be really interesting.
Anyone else? Leela?
You know, I had some notes and I couldn't find them. And so I'm so thankful to Kaneda for kind of giving that summary, because it was getting my brain cells going again and reminding me. And it reminded me of a take home that I remember. I think I might have even commented at the end of the kind of insight notion of values and putting that on the system in terms of how policies, for example, can be the way that values are expressed, like an organization's values can be expressed. So for some reason, I found that super helpful to kind of think of that in that practical way. I might be remembering it wrong, but that's how I'm remembering that conversation.
Yeah, I remember Paige had a thing about, like, you know, value policies equals values equals mind blown. Poof, like that was just such a, it was, I remember that one so clearly. Yeah. And it actually, just to sort of segue now, and just to sort of, and please kind of keep bubbling up, but it's nice to sort of get warmed up that way, that I get to tell you like a story of my experience of working in a system. So in a very practical way, with a leader that I admire a lot, Lynn Zimmer at the YWCA in Peterborough. And so just to be like really clear that this is my story, it's my story of Lynn and my sort of this one person, one piece of an experience that I had quite early on in my career. And so as Megan and I talked about it, we thought it was like a rich story. It was the thing that came to mind for me as we were talking about where we thought the conversation could go. So Megan, is that a good connection now for me to start telling the story?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So I was early in my career. Lynn Zimmer is the executive director of the YWCA. So in Peterborough, it had originally been a swim and gym, but that had kind of that had gone to the YMCA. The YWCA, the Young Women's Christian Organization, was not Christian, and it wasn't even particularly for young women at the time. It was a women's shelter, and it existed. We worked on the mission statement to support women escaping from violence and poverty. And so started as one shelter, and Lynn herself had started one of the very first shelters in Toronto called Interval House, and recently was inducted into the Order of Canada for that. So she had moved to Peterborough to become a very seasoned leader of the YW, and gradually grew the organization to second stage housing for women to get safe housing, and then gradually into a food security program. So where women could get access to food, and then worked on employment. So really this sort of wonderful grassroots organization. And I was there just in the late 90s. And this had happened before I got there, and we were all registered for anti-racism training, and this was the 4th session for the anti-racism training. And so I asked sort of what had happened, and so this was a story that Lynn told me. So the organization had realized, the YW had realized that that Indigenous women weren't coming to the shelter. And they realized, or they thought, that the problem was that there really weren't enough Indigenous faces to welcome women to the shelter. There weren't enough Indigenous people, and that the organization needed to have more Indigenous people involved. And so somehow an Indigenous woman was a volunteer at the YW. I don't know if they recruited her or if she happened to be there, but she was at the front desk, answering calls, like not the crisis line, but just, well, there was an administration office and then there was a shelter, and they were deliberately separate because it was a very public administrative office and a completely anonymous, non-disclosed number, non-disclosed address for the shelter. And so Lynn was giving a tour to a person, and I think so. Let's just say I think the Indigenous person's name was Anne, and so she was at the front desk that afternoon, and Lynn was introducing people, and this is Anne, this is our Indigenous volunteer, and then they said a few pleasantries, and on they went, and Lynn was doing that as a kind of like in this very sort of celebratory way. And later, Anne had gone back to her community and felt really troubled by this introduction about being singled out, about being racialized, about kind of thinking that she'd been a volunteer and now she was like an Indigenous volunteer, and it was just troubling. And so the elders in her community also found this troubling and complained, and it became sort of somehow public, possibly in the newspaper, that the YWCA was a racist organization, or there was racism within the organization. And the elders also contacted Lynn with complaints. And so Lynn apologized, and then there was a circle with everybody and the staff, and everybody sitting in the circle heard the stories, and Lynn again really apologized, and then took steps on her own and on behalf of the organization for everybody to go through anti-racism training, involving really listening to Anishinaabe elders tell the stories of experiences of racism, residential schools, of reasons why Indigenous women didn't access the shelters. And so there was sort of, I loved Lynn for her ability to tell me the story and to talk to me about that apology that she had made. And she recognized that it actually caused some problems amongst some non-Indigenous loyal staff who felt that Lynn had been shamed publicly, and that she felt that it was her role as the executive director to take on that role and to make the change. And that was where she realized that it wasn't sort of to try and squish an Indigenous person into an existing organization, but that the organization has to change. And that for me has shaped so much of the way that I've understood very practically how a leader can influence change, because through her example, she has influenced me in all my subsequent work. So that's how I'm telling that story today. And Megan then had a way of talking about it that I can add in shape, but we thought she could do an insight analysis of that. But I thought if there's any other questions, because as I tell the story, sometimes I leave out details or it may not be as clear. So we thought we would also just ask, like, along the lines of the insight, is there any kind of questions like about what happened? Like if anyone sort of like, who's Lynn, or like, who are you, or anything else that you sort of feel might contribute to your understanding of the case, so you're not kind of like, we're moving along and you're still trying to figure out what happened. So any other questions about that? Yeah, John?
Marnie, who are you in relation to the YWCA? So,
Yeah,
so your role, or that might be helpful.
So I was hired as kind of community development fundraising. It started as like an employment insurance role because I'd moved from Winnipeg. And so I saw myself as like a mentee of Lynn's, because gradually I took on more and more role as like I became a kind of a manager and a director. So I was my role was as community development fundraising type of like development in that way. And so I had two staff, and she would coach me on how to do this. And it was like there's a unionized environment, which was really fascinating, how she managed the union in a very kind of collectively collaborative but separate and recognized way. So yeah, that's who I was in my role. Yeah, and Shauna?
Yeah, did Anne ever come forward directly to Lynn?
So that I don't know, like that wasn't part of my
Mhm.
story. I don't know. The first part of the story is kind of like how I understood us to come to that anti-racism training. So that's, I don't know those parts of the story, but it was very clear there was like this is our Indigenous volunteer, and there was a circle involving, this apology
Mhm.
and this kind of this holding to account,
Mhm.
and then this effort to kind of really change the organization from within, or to
Mm.
sort of shift that space before then saying like, we're really open to Indigenous people to come here.
And just one more question, if I
Yeah.
may. I'm curious with respect to, you mentioned the, you're observing Lynn's actions with the union. Did the union become involved in this alleged racializing?
Yeah, that's a really good question. The union seemed to be like, there was sort of not even a peep like in that way. And the union was a whole interesting other, like that's a whole other story about union labor relations that I learned a lot about. But they were like really solidly on board around like the anti-racism training. And because this was a volunteer, there'd been a lot of like concern about the union in relation to volunteers. And so the volunteers could be in the admin area and not in the shelter. And so they didn't get involved in that way specifically, but were like really on board with the training. As far as I know, like that actually, it wasn't where any of the pushback came in terms of like people feeling like there was a concern. It was more of the kind of admin volunteers, the admin staff who felt quite protective of Lynn in that way. Are there other questions or thoughts on sort of the what happened?
And if you have more as we talk, then ask for sure.
Yeah. Okay. So Megan, how do you understand that in terms of a broken system in what was otherwise a really high functioning organization?
Yeah, but so I really do like this story, Marnie, because, and I think that it touches on all of those questions that were brought up in the beginning, that gap between the actual intended or aspirational outcome and the actual outcome, kind of what is a broken system anyway, and who defines it? How do we know when we see it, right? So, and who gets to say if something's functioning or something isn't working? And so what I like about this story is that there are lots of levels. And as we know in reality, in our day-to-day life, I mean, even listening to that story, it's almost hard to pull out where are the systems, where are, who are the people, kind of separating everything, all the elements from one another. So what I hear in this story, what strikes me first is kind of Lynn's recognition, right? So there's this YWCA, it's a women's shelter. The intended good of the shelter is to help women who are in trouble, who are experiencing violence or homelessness or, that kind of crisis situation. So the intended good is to help them. It sounds like Lynn, and they're doing a great job, except that there's this observation that there's an entire population who may have needs around helping women that aren't being served. And so there's a gap there, right? There's this gap in terms of who can we help? Wow, we're really not helping these people over here who need help. Let's get them in, let's do something about that. Let's fix the system. In this way, it's broken. It's not working to its maximum capacity, right? It might be helping these women in this community and these women in that community, but it's not doing what we hope for, what we want. Our aspirations there are not being fulfilled, right? So there's a gap. This isn't like a malicious gap. It's not really, it's still doing good, but it's not doing as much good as they want. So there are gaps. There's some breakdown there. So Lynn recognizes this. And so what do? They draw on, what does she do? What does the organization do? They feel like, from what I hear from you, Marnie, to fill this gap, to reach that aspirational outcome, they need to bring more Indigenous people in, right? And so that's their solution. That's their answer. We need more Indigenous representation as volunteers, and so the best way to do that is to plop them in seats. Is that about right?
Yeah, and then having her answer the phone so she's kind of representing the YWCA, and there wasn't enough people to sort of hire. So having her as a volunteer, there was that sense of like, okay, let's just have an Indigenous person welcoming people, and that may make us more welcoming to other Indigenous people.
And so what I see here is, again, kind of another layer of systems complexity, where it's not just the YWCA that's in play here. It's the whole, it's another system of, I mean, of white culture, white Canadian culture. If I can say that. I'm not a Canadian, but I'm an American who's white too. So that, and there's this sense of doing good, the sense of tokenism is all that really is necessary, the sense that if we have that face, then that's all we need. So that's very, that's very cultural, right? So there's the YWCA on the one hand, and then there's this influence of this other kind of cultural system that's informing the YWCA's response. So so we can see that there are layers, and surely we're not there. There are other layers as well. There are other systems at play, because we're constantly participating in multiple systems at the same time. Clearly, that system informed so last time I think we talked about how the personal and social are connected, right? So these social systems are only possible because of the decisions that we make within them. So they either are perpetuated in a certain way, or they change because of our decisions to act. And so in this case, that decision to address the problem in this particular way led to kind of an exposure, right? It didn't work. I guess ultimately is what I'm saying, is that it didn't work to fix the system. And instead it exposed a brokenness in this other level of this other cultural level system that was influencing.
So Megan, yeah, and I would say in this way, like it's sort of, so if we break down all the decisions that took place, so, you know, I have a sense that it was the shelter workers as well who are taking the stats, and they're saying like, you know, we're not able to serve Indigenous women. And then that goes up into management saying, okay, how do we solve this problem? I don't know, like, again, where Anne came from, but she felt enough at home in the organization to agree to become a volunteer. And so that as she's there making that decision and having this role, there's another decision for Lynn, in that sense of like, she thought she was doing a really good thing by kind of celebrating, like, here we are, we're a good organization, and here's our Indigenous volunteer, like our Indigenous volunteer. So that whole sort of colonial problem. And so when Anne sort of said, oh, I thought, you know, I mean, am I imagining her and all the different stories, but like that, like, I thought I was kind of helping the organization. And now it looks like this is actually about the organization. Like I'm supposed to sort of, I'm here to make the organization look good. That does not feel right. And so that's where she had felt like she was sort of participating in a particular pattern of cooperation with a particular good. So she may have wanted to be helping Indigenous women, but now she finds like, oh, I'm actually serving some other kind of like feel good thing for the organization. That's not the good that I wanted. That sucks. Like, so she goes to say like, nope, the YWCA. So she says to the elder, and again, I'm making this up in terms of like what, but I can imagine this going to her elders to say like, yeah, the YW says it's for women, but it's actually kind of serving itself and sort of perpetuating this problem of like white people doing good for, you know, it's not a good narrative there. So in that way, then the elders come back. So Megan, like that's where the individuals, and also then what happens in that way is that Lynn's action of just introducing her with that enthusiasm comes to sort of, because she's an individual within the organization, it comes like back through the media that the YWCA is racist. So that she becomes kind of emblematic of the system too. And, you know, she's a skilled mediator and a skilled social worker, and she'd worked with families and could do, you know, understood the way that systems work within families. And that's why women, you know, needed to be in shelters. And so she had this sort of ability to work within systems in some ways, but in this way, that's not how it worked out. So back over to you, Megan, around kind of sort of taking a look then at the next layer of change that happened.
Well, so it sounds from what you're saying that all of these elements impacted Lynn's decision making, what she decided to do, right? And so
Mhm.
here we get into the personal components.
Mhm.
And so that personal threat there of this isn't who I am, this isn't what I want to contribute to, the practical threat of, wow, my actions are perpetuating this system in this way. All of the, I'm sure there are all kinds of levels of threat. And so it sounds like in an expansive space, in a non-conflict space, right? She coordinates with the elders. I'm not sure how that happened, whether she made the outreach or the outreach came to her, but they collaborated in some way to develop a process for healing, for change that resulted in the anti-racism training that tried to shape the system in such a way that was open, wasn't based on tokenism, but was open to, well, curiosity, really, how do we create an environment that is welcoming to Indigenous women on their terms, not on our colonial terms, but on one that that involves everybody in the conversation for, in that expansive, curious way.
Mhm.
So I think that links then to so it illustrates, I mean, and we want to open this up to you and to other sorts of cases, but I think what this begins to show is that when we become aware and when we pay attention to the systems that we're participating in, the outcomes that we're hoping for versus the outcomes that are happening, which can just speed by us, right? We're so habitual and but when we stop to pay attention, then we can notice where the gaps are, how they're affecting us in our own interior decision making that is impacting those outcomes.
Mm. And I guess the thing that I'd like to leave on too in that way, and hearing, I'm really looking forward to hearing other people's like, oh, this makes me think of in the way that this kind of, that we can add to. But it feels to me like what Lynn did for me in that way, and through her example, was she became kind of like the chief mistake officer in that way. Like she was open to recognizing her mistake, using that mistake in a way that then could actually lead to a better, so they tried something, it failed spectacularly, and so then she was open to trying something else, and that she was open to that kind of humbleness and the humility, and even in that moment the humiliation of it, to be able to move forward in a way that then I think was healthier. Like certainly I could feel it that way, and what I don't know what other people's the impact was over it was a thread that kept moving through, and it happened such a long time ago, and I honestly don't remember then, because how I have a sense then that Indigenous women actually were able to, I think, with other kinds of support, start another kind of appropriate service, as well as working in connection with the YWCA. But it was the way that there was that movement forward through the sort of that real contraction of threat, and then the ability to kind of be able to not defend, but to be able to experience the threat and then respond, and in a way that was like more open to other kinds of possibilities, to be able to learn, as Cheryl talks about so much, is that she her curiosity was able to be opened in a way that she could then, okay, that wasn't it, what else can we do?
Mm-hmm. And not only that, but serve as a model for others, right? So her conscientiousness, her expansiveness, and her decision making influences other people, and that actually impacts systems, right? That changes, that creates more responsive patterns of cooperation that lead to, that one would expect would lead to goods of order that are, again, not page necessarily fully smoothly operating all the time, but accountable to those gaps and aware and responsive to when those outcomes aren't being achieved in the way that is intended.
Mm-hmm. Accountable to the gaps is like another be a nice title for a book.
Yeah.
So what are other thoughts, like just knowing the people in this group? I'm imagining that there's a lot of bubbling and everyone's waiting patiently to take their turn. But if we were on a one-on-one, there would be like blah 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 blah. So what's on your minds? And so the chat is really open, and unmuting is also possible.
Mm.
Go, Shauna.
Oh, I just wanted to say, as you were speaking, both you, Megan, and you, Marnie, I couldn't help but reflect on the tokenism that I've experienced and I'll say in my current role. Noticing it, responding to it, being transparent about it, and then trying to mitigate, I'll say, the conflict around the tokenism. Very difficult in an organization where tokenism seems to be a way of supporting the voice of the Indigenous women. And that's just an observation. And also a complaint from many participants in the organization. So just that whole piece, and there's a huge learning around moving away from tokenism to diversity, I find. So that just resonated with me when you talked about tokenism.
Are there people?
I think
Maybe I could just keep going, like with kind of just sort of, I'm imagining like just a comment storm or a question storm, or just having everybody sort of give something of, you know, what you've got, and then we can kind of respond back. How does that sound as a process, Megan?
Sure.
Yeah.
I was going to say, like, what struck me, Marnie, when you were telling your story is that you talked about this incident occurring in the late 1990s. And it sort of reveals like a greater broken system within our country rather than just within Interval House. Given, I don't know how many Canadians are on this call, but there's been in the news here a lot of I guess issues with Indigenous, and they found like mass grave sites at many schools. And it like strikes me that there was people that experienced these problems in the 1990s and probably much earlier, and it didn't seem to fix the broken systems within Canada, despite the fact that they were revealed.
Mm-hmm.
I think one thing, and can I respond? I mean, I think Kanata and also Shauna, what you're saying, and I think what is something that we have to constantly keep in mind, because there are no easy answers and systems are huge and lumbering and very difficult to change, is that noticing, right, that Cheryl uses the term, you know, heightening your awareness, you know, accentuating your attention to the pieces that aren't working. It's not, they're almost gifts, right? It's almost like in conflict, we can grow, right? That I feel threatened and I'm really mad, but this is my opportunity to share what matters to me and who I am and you know, what's going on, so that we can move together better in a better way. So in America, I mean, we're totally messed up. But I mean, there are so many problems, you know, but being aware of them, noticing them, holding them up as issues to be addressed, I think is courageous and important.
So Leela, Paige, Colleen, John, Cheryl, Cynthia, anyone want to say something else in response?
I don't have any, not in response. It might kind of take us a different direction, but what I was thinking about is Megan's thoughts on personal threats impacting your decisions and how that impacts the system. And I'm working on I don't know if you know me, I'm a professional forester in British Columbia. I'm working on an article right now for our professional magazine about this whole concept about individuals and professionals being kind of tending to avoid conflict, and then it kind of causes us to be silent in the public sphere and the public conversation around things like old growth or whatever. And because of the personal threats and like, well, I don't want to stick my neck out and say something. I just, I want to keep my head down and keep my job. I don't want to be publicly, coming out against my employer or whatever it is. And so for all these personal threats, we stay silent. But then when collectively as a profession, we stay silent, then the system, then our role kind of as knowledge keepers or experts in the system is just like continually diminished over time. And it really has these systems level impacts because of our each of us kind of perceiving this personal threat to sticking our hands up and saying something, right? So anyways, that really stuck with me, and and it's great timing because that's something that I'm trying to figure out in my head for the article as well. So
thank you. And Don, I see your mic is off. Yeah, want to say something?
Thanks, Cynthia. I just to link it to what Cynthia's saying, and then taking it back a little. Whenever I think of systems, so and I think about your story, Marnie, and that's why I asked what your role is, because whatever my experience of a system, it's going to be based on a whole lot of factors, but my role and how I fit and don't fit and what's going on inside of me, which is what I love about Insight, is that it focuses on that connection within to the external and the system I'm working in. I just, what is going through my mind as the conversation led into the story and then through the story, even the idea, I'm going back right to what you said, Paige, at the beginning around, so what is broken? How do I experience, or and I don't look for definition. I actually don't. I stay away from that, but so I'm not looking for definition of broken, but the fact that we would even think that a system might be broken is really interesting, right, in itself, because that means that something about the system is not functioning, but according to the way I'm viewing it. It might not be on my own view, it might be someone else's view where it might be described as broken. So and then as you were saying, Megan, there's systems within systems. And so if we fix something, because if it's broken, I tend to want to fix. So I think about the way we work in kind of linear models. It's like if it's bust, fix it, right? So broken equal fix. So I really can relate to what Lynn was doing, Marnie, because she needed to fix it. Right? And I think part of the challenge for me in my work in system is that I see it with leaders and others I work with, that if we see an issue, something that's not working, I call it a pain point, then that's where we tend to want to work in change. And I think the example is a great one where if we're seeing it systemically, and that's the advantage of systems approach thinking and engagement is that it's not automatic that where the pain point is that we would need to put the energy or the action. So that was going through my mind as we were talking here, right, around this particular problem. So it's a great example, because then when Lynn does that, and at one level, it's not a bad fix, but then it reveals, but that fix or that action in the system, what I like about it is it's using feedback. So Lynn is aware of the feedback around what's going on. And the feedback leads to another layer or another level. And you were saying that, Megan. I'm just going back on what you're saying. So all to say, as I was thinking about it, it is a nice example because it demonstrates that the moment one is in and living and working in a system and acting and responding, it is changing. it is changed. And so I don't, I mean, systems can go to the point of equilibrium, but even that point, it's like a centers of gravity move and change depending on orientations of different parts of a physical object. So it's continuously moving. So when I think about system and I think about what we're talking about here, the value of going to insight approach to it, and it comes back to what Cynthia is asking around the value of the personal, what's going on for me. So if I understand some of that, I can actually use that in helping me to not only be part, productive or constructive part of that system, but actually to help me make sense of the system at the same time. So part of the awareness of self in relation to other is really important. And I think part of my roots, which go back to Africa, where I've spent most of my life, what's interesting about system there is that I'm generalizing, and one's got to be careful with generalization, but generally, Africans, I'm generalizing, would tend to see themselves not as individual in system, but as part of, in relation to others. So I cannot experience, I cannot be myself without you. I'm only myself in relation to you. So that's a concept that's called Ubuntu. So I'm not fully who I am without you. I'm only who I am in relation to you. So it kind of goes back to that around the circle. So I like the story and the way you pulled that apart, Megan.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Can I jump in, Marnie?
Please.
Well, I'm actually going to pick up a bit from what John was saying, and your story took me back to some of the earlier work that I did at the university, and the importance. What I particularly liked about what the two of you were talking about, where there were some concepts or words that you use that were not familiar to me, the concept of actual versus intended outcomes and how you're using that. And I really appreciated being able to sit back and listen to it in the terms of organizations and systems. So I come from very much, as all of you would likely know, an interpersonal small group perspective. But what I thought about when you were talking was, and this is before Insight, was work that I had done in large organizations where the organization was fractured. We'll call it a department. Makes probably more sense in terms of the story, but they were fractured. The whole social structure of that department had become polarized over a particular issue. And I was asked to come in and help them fix it. And, I was saying to the people who were inviting me in, you have to give me enough time to go back to the beginning. You have to give time to go back and see where this started. It isn't just at the level of the organization, it is at the level of the personal. And very often when you go back, you find that what's developed over time is that, a small number of people, as little as two, maybe, larger, have come to engage in a conflict situation that has escalated over time. And what they've done is they brought in the other members of the department that support them, and then they construct the other as the evil outcome people over the evil people over there. And I just thought it's so welcoming that you're really focusing on here in these conversations, the relationship between the personal and the social, that they do exist and are so tightly tied. And sometimes we go in and try to fix the system without paying enough attention. I think that's what you're saying, John. We can't go in and fix a system without paying attention to the individual as well and the personal as well. And there's no shortcut around that they are so intertwined. And I just wanted to say to the two of you, congratulations for the conversation, because I'm finding it very interesting and making sense of things in a way I wouldn't have made sense of before in the past. So, thanks.
There's two things that come to mind for me in this, like from Cynthia and from Cheryl, because when I was learning from Cheryl, like she would spend, like Cheryl, you spend a lot of time on the deepening, you know, on sort of discovering the threats, on like wondering what they are, if there's more expansive possibilities. And then you like didn't really think, you know, worry too much about the agreement or because like people can do that once they get all of the other things sort of, once the insights come, once there's more expansive ways of understanding and valuing. And it seems to me that in mediation, where there's a kind of a sense of like a focus on agreement, which is kind of like that fixing, that's too, it's, as Dawn says, like that's a sort of effort to fix the pain point rather than look for the actual leverage point, which is like in a very different place than what the focus is. And it reminds me of this like mind-blowing interview I heard with a forester, Suzanne Simard, who's like probably like well-known in forestry land. And I don't know, I mean, she's kind of like all over everywhere right now. But so my understanding of her as a layperson, so Cynthia, this is another conversation we could have, but that she struck me as like a Jane Goodall of forestry, where like Jane Goodall went and actually kind of watched what was happening with the gorillas, and Suzanne Simard has kind of looked what happens with forests, and where there's been this kind of typical, like a sort of in the 50s, like take down the forests and then regrow them, and they compete for light. But she like underground in the roots, there's this deep interconnection, so that they may be competing, a birch and a pine, but underneath in the roots, they're interconnected and nourishing each other. And it's particularly through the mushrooms and the rhizomes that this kind of the interconnection happens, and this growth becomes even more possible through the diversity. And so where I've sort of felt then is like the role of like being a mushroom in an organization is actually quite a noble one, about that sort of that sense of like being sort of these little nodes of interconnection where there can be these points of nourishing, where, you know, there's that everyone has different roles. Sometimes it is the leader of an organization, but sometimes it is just being an influencer within the organization that can also be quite transformative, which is where the sense of like where the role is, and then also that like where the narrative image is. Where's this sense of like, how am I, what is the where, well, and as Shauna said, the unconscious bias. So for the YWCA, the sense of like, we're serving all women, but you know, the all doesn't include Indigenous women. That like that image didn't include Indigenous women, or it would have been very changed had it really been like all women, like we actually mean all women. And that sense of like how systems work, and what we're supposed to be doing when we discover that there's these gaps. I think those all really do function at that level of who we see ourselves, and the metaphors that we use, and the kinds of stories that are told within an organization. Since I've referenced you so much, do you want to come back on that, or are you like, as like, was that a painful thing to hear a layperson talk about forestry, or was it okay?
It wasn't too painful. I have my own opinions on Suzanne,
Yeah.
but she was my ecology professor in undergrad, so there's going to be a movie about her life, and I think just coming back, everyone's kind of hit on it, just this connection between the personal and social, and really being able to illustrate what that looks like in each case. And I think there are a few comments, I wasn't here in July, but there are a few comments about like, how can this be practical, or what can I do, right? Like, I think that's a lot of times for me with Insight has always been like, okay, well, now what? Like, what can I do? But I think if you're able to pull it in, finding those personal threats, then it's really more individual. Like, you can turn that into what can I do, and what can I change when you can see the connection of your role within the system. And so I think that's really great point.
Cynthia, something that I would love to talk about, and I don't know if this would be useful for you in relation but when you sort of talk about with foresters, and that, like, because we all face gaps in like speaking out about something that we discern as like significant, is that the challenge that I face when I'm faced with a personal gap and I'm scared to step out because I'm recognizing like, ooh, I could get publicly shamed here, or I could get called out, is like being told like, don't feel that gap, like don't feel that threat, or you're so. What are the resources that you're, have you got to that point of like, where are the resources that people can draw on to be able to take that kind of risk, even in the face of that kind of possible threat of stepping out of what's expected from silence? So I'd love to hear what other people have to say about that.
I got to pick up on the idea that two ideas that have come from this. One is that organizations face threats as well. So it's not just the people individually within them, but the organization itself. And I think it's equally important to be asking, what are the threats for the organization as we begin to work with both the personal and the social. So I just wanted to say that. But the other one, in terms of, what can I do when I'm facing threat? I guess the response for me would be to verify whether there really is a threat. Mm-hmm. We conjure these threats in many ways, not that they're not real and we don't experience them. I'm not saying that, but part of the insight method that I think is so valuable is that we are taught to do the verification piece about the threat. Mm-hmm. And we can do that for ourselves. What am I threatened by, and is it a real threat, or am I, imagining this, and then how do I deal with it? So just two quick thoughts.
Shauna?
I love the metaphor around the node, that how you talk, the node or the influencer, or, just being kind of supporting and nourishing, never mind what's going on top. And so I really appreciate that metaphor as a bit of a influencer.
Just on that note, John, I see you have your microphone off. My she's now 8-year-old daughter, Roma, they did this songs about a whole musical about biomes, and one of the songs that she would walk around the house belting out is "Fungi are our friends." There you go.
Just a thought as well, kind of coming back to where do people find resource. I wanted to just acknowledge the very fact that Lynn and you, Marnie, and the organization heard Anne, that they heard it, is very significant in the story to me, because so often that's missed, right? So the very opportunity for change in the system is missed because we're not listening for the feedback or engaging for the feedback. So the very fact that her voice was heard in the solution, because often when we find a solution, we don't want to hear any problem about it. We want to see it just work, right? So the very fact that she was heard, I just want to raise that. So, and that, I'm not sure the exact context, but they would be saying something about that organization's culture, which is good. So there was some learning openness in it, which is wonderful. And then, but she probably had support herself in some form in terms of community. And then that would link back to her base and her community.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think we talked, it's that openness, that paying attention, that expansive, mindset that allows for threat, that allows for uncertainty and all those things. And Cynthia, one of the things that really resonated with me, what you said, what do we do? And one thing I think that one gift I think of the insight approach, why I love it and to use it, is because it allows the solutions to really emerge from the context. And it's unsettling to not know beforehand. We want the fix, we want the solution, we want to have the plan beforehand. But if we can be curious and pay attention and understand what are the threats, what's going on, what's leading to this, that, and the other decision that's impacting the system in this way, then that's where we find those leverage points, or that's where we find creatively the solutions that might shift the dynamics. I'm really interested, Paige. I mean, you brought up in the beginning, what are the fundamentals? I'm not even sure that I'm clear on them. And I don't know if we sorted any of that out in these stories in this conversation, but I'd love to hear kind of where you are.
I don't know that an hour is enough to to do that, but I think there were good efforts made, and I think it went in a number of interesting directions. I think what's really standing out for me is just kind of the layers that are building out, right? And so, Marnie, when you mentioned that Lynn was kind of emblematic of the organization in this way, right? And then what Cynthia was sharing about kind of being the one to stick your hand up and kind of own those pieces. I mean, that's a big systems failure in terms of like how we understand accountability and how we manage those pieces. And so I'm just thinking a lot about kind of systems within systems within systems, and just feeling very, very small, but perhaps kind of circling back to the mushrooms as well. So lots to marinate on, but really appreciate the conversation.
Thanks for that. All right, well, we have just a few more minutes. Are there any other comments or bubbles, like Marnie likes to say, bubbling up from anybody who maybe hasn't had a chance to speak? Not to put you on the spot, Jennifer.
Well, I think what I'm trying to ponder is this concept of broken systems, because is the system really broken? And it's come up in a couple of questions. John mentioned defining it, Paige mentioned from whose point of view, because I think a counter argument could be that because in this case, the system was willing to listen and be curious, was it broken? I think I'm struggling a bit with that framing of it, because every interaction between people and between systems has the potential to be characterized as broken. So yeah, I don't know if I'm gelling with that particular framing of it. Mm-hmm. But in terms of understanding, curiosity and insight and being open and expansive, yes, I'm all on board. And I think that's wonderful to foster. So yeah, I'm just marinating on this term broken systems, because I think a case can be made that all systems in some ways can be broken.
Right.
I don't know.
I think I really appreciate that. I mean, there's something final about something that's broken. There's something, or it has to be repaired or restored to its original shape, or that there's the flip side is something that's perfect and smooth and functioning. Whereas in fact, all systems are made up of human beings who are incapable of that kind of perfection, right? So we're always moving, learning, like John was saying, we're always trying to find our point of balance or equilibrium. Time moves, things change. It's a precarious spot. So yeah, I think that broken systems is an inadequate term, but it's interesting to start there and think about, well, what is it really, Yeah.
We're reaching at the end of our time, because I was about to ask you, Megan, to just, in like 5 seconds or less, talk about the American policing system broken. I
have an article on that if you want to read it.
Yeah, well, send that along. That would actually be really wonderful through the listserv or something, because I think that could be really, you've been doing a lot of thinking with your colleagues your policing colleagues about that. And so it's another kind of conversation to be had. But I'm also sort of aware of the time and wondering if there's any sort of other kind of rapid. Actually, it'd be really helpful. Again, I'd love to hear just if there's a sentence or two that you take away from what you've learned and what you've gotten from here, and to just do that in alphabetical order with people just saying pass if they want to. Is that okay to do that? I'll try and do my. I used to be a page. It was my first job in the library when I was 13 years old. So I'm really good at the alphabet. Really good. So we'd start with C, which begins with CH, which would be Cheryl. It goes Cheryl, Colleen, and then Cynthia.
I think I've said what I said. I really enjoyed it, and thank you for putting it on. Good.
Awesome. Colleen, and then Cynthia, and then Jennifer.
I think I really appreciated being kind of resaturated in insight type language. I haven't kind of tuned into the insight world in a little bit. And so it's nice to just kind of reintegrate into that, and definitely took some pieces away, mostly the re-emphasis that it wasn't said here, but this conversation reminded me that change happens when individuals make different decisions, and individuals make up systems. And so whenever a system seems stuck or broken, it's in the individual where the change can happen. And so it's just kind of a reminder that that's the case for me. So thanks for people's thoughts. It's nice to be saturated.
So Cynthia, and then Jennifer and John.
I'm going to go with something Megan said. Social systems change because of our decisions to act. And I think that's just really timely for what I'm thinking through right now. So that was really great. Thanks.
Jennifer, John, Canada.
Thank you. I appreciated that this idea of the gap between intended goods and aspirations, and again, just coming back to being curious, because in that story, things could have been very different had Lynn reacted differently to that. And so that ability to maintain curiosity. Yeah, thank you.
Oh, thank you, Jennifer. So John, Canada, and then me.
Yeah, thank you, Megan. Thanks, Marnie, and everyone. I just, one of the things I carry with me, I just want to think about it more, is around the brokenness piece, right? Because sometimes in the brokenness lies the value. So the way we define the brokenness, in fact, so why do systems keep being broken and continue to be broken? And what is that? So in that lies some of the ways to the next, whatever the next is in that sense. So I'll carry that brokenness with me. Thank you.
I just appreciate being able to engage and hear about these ideas. I've listened to like what John said about like broken systems and whose idea is it broken, and then the impermanence of things and the imperfectness of people. So it's pretty complicated, but I enjoy being able to hear everybody's thoughts. I appreciate for being included. Thank you.
I just got a wave of relief sort of washing over me again, because I've just been so concerned about climate change. And so to hear that sort of reminder about this sort of this continual breakage, and then this movement through, and this sense of like there's this really massive change that's underway. And so that just is the way in which it's like, okay, and then there's going to be something after that. And that's what I just, because I sometimes get stopped. That's where my threat goes, is I just stop, and thinking like, okay, there's something after it is tremendously hopeful for me. Over to Megan, and then Paige, and then Shauna.
Oh, yeah, thank you for this conversation. I'm really excited to be hearing the idea that the link between the personal and social is graspable, and it's something that we can experience, that we see in our everyday lives, because I think that it's a really profound component, and it really is kind of the place to put our attention in order to shift, to change, to be aware of the brokenness and how we actually engage with it. So this was great for me. Thank you.
Yeah, I appreciate the opportunity for this conversation. And I think what's kind of striking me just as we wrap up here is that if we're always changing, then the intended good of any system should be always adapting, right? And so the best design systems then would be kind of always breaking. And so I think that kind of maybe draws to what John was saying about kind of finding the beauty in that. And so not being functional for very long. So I guess where I'm kind of left today is wondering about how can we be expansive and attuned to the harms that are created and coming out of those systems before they happen. So that we're not reactive, so that we're attentive in advance. And I don't know what that looks like, but that's kind of what's coming up for me. And maybe there is no way, maybe that we do have to just keep learning from harm. And that's its own kind of system and how we're moving through it. But yeah, this has been a very kind of uplifting conversation, I guess, in that way, like Marnie had said.
And Shauna.
Oh, I was reflecting on John contributing the whole Ubuntu piece, and combined with Cheryl's comments about personal and social relationships and the need to focus on the individual and the system, and then how this all fits into the system. And I like to think of systems as being responsive and also curious and open. And so it just broadened my thinking. So thank you very much, everyone.
Well, thank you, everybody. And thanks for staying the extra time. And so the Insight Summit is rapidly coming upon us. So the September 30th and October 1st, it's going to be really amazing. So John is going to be speaking with another peace builder, Andrea Bartoli. Cheryl's giving 2 workshops on insight mediation. And so on September 14th, I'm going to be talking to Cheryl and to Ken Melchin, which we're going to do as a kind of a recording piece, which is I'm really looking forward to, about sort of key aspects of insight practice. And Chuk Ubasi is doing this like a podcast type of storytelling event on day 2 of the summit. So, and there's one of the workshops is going to be with Jackie Adams, who's a host at Anuchanath from the Vancouver Island. So she's from the 2 First Nations here, who's going to be leading a circle in one of the workshops. So there's just so many different layers, something for everyone in this way of being able to find sort of the method of discovery through insight, that we're on this journey together. So I'm really looking forward to seeing those of you who can make it, and to remind you to sign up if you haven't, and we'll see some of you on the 14th and some of you on the 30th.
Great. So wonderful to see everybody.
Okay.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Bye.
Bye.